A man stands knee-deep in black water, cutting bricks of earth. It is barely light. He has been at this since before dawn, and he will not stop until dark. The bricks are peat. Dried out, they burn like coal. In a country with almost no coal and no forest left to spare, that made them worth a fortune. This black mud heated the houses, fired the kilns, and boiled the brewing vats of the richest nation in 17th-century Europe. The Dutch Golden Age ran on it, but the man cutting it lived in a hut of turf and ate on credit he could never clear. He would most likely die on this same moor, no richer than the day he started. That is the strange cruelty buried in this story. The more peat these men cut, the poorer they tended to get. Tonight we follow that block of peat off the moor and into the fire, and the men who cut it into a trap they could not dig their way out of. Where the fuel came from, and why a whole nation was built on rotten swamp. How the work was done by hand, in cold water, for next to nothing. The sickness in the bog, and the machine of debt that kept the diggers poor while the moor made other men rich. By the end you will see why the ground these men carved away is still sinking under Dutch houses today. But this story does not start with the man in the mud. It starts with a country that had run out of ways to keep warm. Picture the Low Countries 500 years ago. Flat, wet, green, and almost completely treeless. The great forests that once covered northern Europe had been cleared off this corner of it long before, and what timber remained was far too valuable to throw on a fire. There was no coal under the ground worth digging, not yet. So how does a cold, damp country with no wood and no coal keep millions of people warm through a North Sea winter and fire the workshops that made it rich? The answer was lying under their feet the whole time. Peat. For thousands of years in the waterlogged bogs of the north and west, dead moss and reed and bog plants had been piling up faster than they could rot. Pressed down under their own weight, layer on layer, century on century, they turned into a dense brown mass of half-made coal. Cut it out, dry it in the wind, and it burns. One bog could hold the slow harvest of 10,000 years of dead plants, and the Dutch learned to mine it like a seam of gold. It is hard to overstate how much of the Dutch miracle this one dirty fuel made possible. The breweries, the bakeries, the brick and tile works, the lime kilns, the sugar refineries, the salt and soap boilers, all of them ran on peat. A growing city like Amsterdam swallowed enormous quantities of it every year just to cook and stay warm. Cheap, abundant heat sitting in the ground, ready for anyone with a spade and a strong back, and that is where the men in the mud come in, because the peat did not cut itself. There were two kinds of bog, and they punished the body in two different ways. In the west, near the cities, the peat lay below the water table. You could not simply walk out and cut it. Men dredged it up from under the water with a long-handled scoop net, hauled the dripping black sludge to the bank, trod it down with their bare feet into a thick paste, and cut the dried slabs out months later. In the high bogs of the north and east, in Drenthe and Groningen, the peat sat in vast raised domes above the water, and there you drained it, then cut down into it with a spade, slab by slab, deeper every year. Either way, you did not own the ground. The moor belonged to a company, or a town, or a wealthy investor, and these men had a system. They bought a stretch of raw bog for almost nothing. Then they dug a canal into it. The canal did two jobs at once. It drained the water out of the bog so the peat could be cut, and it carried the cut peat out on barges to the cities that paid for it. Off the main canal they cut smaller ditches, like the veins off an artery, until the whole moor was carved into a grid of black water and drying fields. This was clever, and it was profitable, and you should notice who controlled every part of it. The man who owned the canal owned the only road out. Nothing left the moor, and nobody got paid except along his water. Remember that. It is going to matter more than anything else in this story. To work the bog, the owners needed hands, thousands of them, and they recruited the only people desperate enough to come, the landless, the poor of other regions, whole families who had nothing, drawn by the promise of work and a place to live on the edge of the moor. They came. And what they walked into was a life so hard it is difficult to picture from a warm room. Cutting peat was some of the most brutal manual labour in early modern Europe, and it never let up. The season ran through the warm months because the peat had to dry in the open air, which meant the hardest work landed in the heat. A digger worked bent double or standing in cold water for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. He cut the wet slabs with a special long spade, swung and placed and swung again, thousands of times, until his hands were raw and his back would not straighten. The wet peat was heavy, far heavier than the dry brick it became, and every block had to be lifted, carried, stacked to drain, turned, restacked, and carried again, and he was not paid by the hour. He was paid by the piece, by the quantity of peat he produced, which meant the only way to earn a little more was to work a little harder and a little longer. So the whole family went into the bog. The wife stacked and turned the drying slabs. The children, small ones, carried peat and trod the paste, and fetched and hauled from the time they could walk. There was no childhood out on the moor. There was only the next field of peat and the daylight you had left to work it. A good digger could move an astonishing amount of earth in a day. It still was not enough to get ahead, and the reason why is the part that turns this from a hard job into a trap. Where did these families live? Not in anything you would call a house. The classic home of the peat worker was the plagen hut, the sod hut, and it was made of the same moor they were digging. You cut a shallow pit in the ground for a floor, raised low walls of stacked turf, leaned a roof of poles, and reed and more turf over the top, and that was it. One room, often shared with a goat or a pig, with a hole for the smoke that mostly did not find it. The floor was bare earth and usually damp. In a wet autumn, the water came up through it. These huts were so low and so plain that travellers passing through the peat districts wrote about them with genuine horror, describing people living in holes in the ground, more like animals than the citizens of the wealthiest country in Europe. And here is the bitter little detail at the centre of it. These were the people who cut the fuel that warmed a nation, and they often could not keep their own one room warm, because every block of peat in the hut was a block they could not sell. They lived inside the wealth, and were not allowed to touch it. That is not an accident of bad luck. It was built into the system, on purpose, and to see how you have to follow the money off the moor. What actually trapped these families was not the hard work, and it was not even the poverty of the wage. It was the way the wage was paid. Out on an isolated moor, far from any town, there was usually only one shop. And the man who owned the shop was the same man who owned the canal, the land, and the work. The digger was very often not paid in real money at all. He was paid in tokens, or in credit, that were only good at that one company store. The boss set the wage. The boss also set the prices in the shop where the wage had to be spent. Bread, flour, lard, tobacco, beer, all of it bought from the company, at whatever the company chose to charge. You can see where this goes. If a family did not earn enough in a season to cover what they ate, and very often they did not, the difference was not forgiven. It was written down as debt. They started the next season already owing money, which meant they could not leave, because you do not walk away from the only man who will employ you while you owe him for last winter's bread. The harder times got, the deeper the debt, and the deeper the debt, the more completely they belonged to the moor. This system had a name in Dutch, and it was hated. It tied generations of families to the bog with no wall and no chain, only a ledger. So picture the whole arrangement now, A man cuts a fortune in fuel out of the ground. The fuel goes out on a canal he does not own, to a city he will never see, to warm houses he could never afford. His pay comes back as credit at a shop that charges him more than he earns, and the gap becomes a debt that hands his children to the same moor. The golden age glowed on one end of that canal. This is what the other end looked like. For all the misery, there is something worth holding on to here. These were astonishingly capable people. They built their own homes out of the ground, baked their own bread, and got by on raw skill and stubbornness when they had almost nothing else. If putting your own hands on the past appeals more than just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery collection. The practical recipes book walks you through the dishes themselves. The sourdough manual is for keeping a living leaven, the way poor households did when bread was survival. The sourcing guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. The bread is where this kitchen begins. But while these families scraped by on that skill, the bog they worked was quietly working against them. As if the work and the debt were not enough, the bog itself was trying to kill them. Standing water breeds mosquitoes, and the drained, half-flooded peat districts were one long breeding ground. For centuries, these wetlands carried what people called marsh fever, the shivering, recurring sickness we now know was a form of malaria, and it was endemic across the low, wet Netherlands. It did not always kill outright. It came back season after season, draining the strength out of people who had no strength to spare, leaving them weak for the very work they could not afford to miss. Add the accidents, the lungs ruined by a lifetime of cold, damp air and peat smoke, the children who did not survive a bad winter in a wet hut, and the arithmetic of the moor becomes very dark. People were used up. When one digger broke down, there was always another landless family at the edge of the bog, ready to take the spade. This was one of the most miserable places to be poor in all of Europe, and the people who lived there knew it better than anyone. Which is why, eventually, they stopped simply enduring it. The peat districts became some of the angriest places in the country, and it is not hard to understand why. Men who had nothing to lose, packed into the same misery, working for the same handful of bosses, are exactly the people who organise. Through the late 1800s, the peat regions of the north became a heartland of strikes and early socialism, a stronghold for anyone promising the diggers that the ledger could be broken. When the work was bad and the prices in the company's store rose, the moor erupted. They walked off the fields. Sometimes it turned to open clashes, with troops sent in to face down men armed with nothing but their spades. They did not always win, but the silence that the system depended on was over, and the comfortable men at the city end of the canal were for the first time afraid of the men at the muddy end. For the first time, the ledger that bound them looked like something that could be broken. And then the deeper turn arrived, the one nobody on the moor had planned for. The peat began to run out. A bog is the harvest of 10,000 years, and you can cut it in 2 or 3 generations. Once a stretch of moor was dug down to the sand beneath it, the work was simply gone, and so was the reason anyone had ever come. Families who had been promised a life on the edge of the bog found that the bog had an end, and on the far side of that end there was nothing for them at all. They drifted on to the next raw moor, or to the growing cities, carrying their debts and their fevers with them. But the diggers had not just removed a fuel, they had removed the land. The high domes of living bog, which had stood proud above the water, were gone, cut away, and burned in distant stoves. And what they left behind was a flat, sunken, exhausted plain that sat lower than it ever had. They had spent their lives, their health, and their children's childhoods turning their own country into a hole. Walk those old peat districts today, and the story has not finished settling, not even close. The land never recovered its height because you cannot put a bog back the way you can replant a forest. And the peat that remains, the deeper layers nobody cut, is still causing trouble, because drained peat does not just sit there quietly. Once you pull the water out and let the air in, the old bog slowly oxidizes, which is a careful way of saying it rots and vanishes into the sky. The ground keeps dropping, year after year, in the worst places by a finger's width every single season. It cracks house foundations, tilts roads, and buckles pipes across a wide stretch of the modern Netherlands, and the repair bill runs into the billions. Whole neighbourhoods built on the old drained peat are now slowly tilting, their wooden foundation piles rotting as the water table that once protected them falls away beneath them. On top of that, all the slowly vanishing carbon goes up as greenhouse gas, which makes these old, tidy farmlands one of the country's quiet climate problems. The Dutch are now spending real money to do the one thing the whole system was built to prevent. They are pushing the water back into the ground, re-wetting the old bogs, trying to stop the land from sinking and the carbon from escaping. After 400 years, the country is paying to undo the very drainage that once made it rich. Go back to that man, knee-deep in the black water at first light, cutting bricks of earth he will never be allowed to burn. He thought he was just digging fuel. He was actually digging a hole that his whole country would still be standing at the bottom of, centuries after his name was forgotten. The Golden Age remembered the warmth. It forgot the moor and the men who froze on it so the rest could be warm. We dig up the history the textbooks burned for fuel. Would you have lasted one winter on that moor? Subscribe and stay curious.